So can you all hear me? Excellent, fantastic. Okay, my name's Chris. Welcome to my Developer's Introduction to Lightning talk. This is mainly aimed at those of you who have Visualforce Apex knowledge, but have yet to come across into Lightning or have yet to do any Lightning component development. Cool. So rather than creating Visualforce pages like we currently do, over in Lightning we will be creating Aura bundles. I'm going to cover three parts of the Aura bundle in this talk. So the first one we're going to be covering is the component. Just to give you an overview of the component, it's very, very similar to your Visualforce pages that you get. So in there, this is where you'll have your HTML markup. You'll have these new Lightning tags in the component, which are your Aura and UI namespaces. And also in the component, we'll also find other components. So just like with Visualforce, we can just still embed components within one another. The next thing we'll talk about is going to be the controller. So this is a JavaScript controller, which is a part of the bundle. The easiest way to think about this is essentially your event handler. So anything you fire from your component is going to be picked up by your controller, and that will handle the events appropriately. And then lastly, we'll cover over for the helper. So the JavaScript helper is the same thing. This is where you do all your heavy lifting. So very similar to what you would do in Apex. You'd have your controller. You might then fire that off to a worker or a utility method. It's exactly the same kind of principle there. Right. I've got a really short demo. So using those three components, I created a really, really quick demo to run you through. And then what we'll do is after that, we'll go and have a look at the code behind it and look at the differences. So hopefully, if I switch this over, I need to give it a second. Awesome. Okay. If we just reload this. So just to give you a quick overview of what this is, help if I logged in. So to give you a really quick overview of what I've built here. This is really, really simple. It's just a single input. We put in an account name, and all it's going to do is go off to the server, go and collect a collection of accounts that are similar to that name, and just return them to the screen. So if we quickly just do a quick search for United. Okay, so that's taken our input, gone off to the server, and brought us back the accounts. It's as simple as that. So let's go and have a look at the code underneath. Okay, so let's have a look at our component. So this is very similar to Visualforce. So a couple of things we're just going to point out with this that we'll run through. Firstly, our controller, so exactly the same with Visualforce. We're just referencing our Apex controller. It's exactly the same. Our Visualforce, in Visualforce, we're using your Apex style sheets and your include scripts. They've been replaced with this new Lightning require tag. So this is where we'll specify our styles, any external scripts that we might want to bring in. So you might notice on the styles I've used a relative path there to go and reference my CSS. You can, just like Visualforce, use the $resource global variable that is available in Lightning. Just one thing to note, it is different interpretation. So it's not exactly the same global variable. So things like URL4 don't exist in the Lightning version. So it's just something to watch out for and go and have a read up on. And then lastly, once we've pulled those in, we have an after scripts loaded tag, and all that's doing is just saying, okay, once the page is rendered and we've pre-processed that, we want to go and run our init function. Also, on the component, so we have our working variables, which I've put at the top. So in Apex, we don't need to specify our attributes anymore that we would bind to usually in our Visualforce page. These are now declared directly in your component. So obviously for the app that I've built, I've got two attributes there. I've just got one, which is just an account, which I'll bind to, and then we've got a collection of accounts, which is obviously where we store our returned results. Further down the page, we've got the iteration block, which outputs these to the page. Again, so this is now an Aura iteration rather than your standard Apex repeat. It's exactly the same thing, very, very similar markup with that, sort of looping over your collection and referencing your individual ones. One thing I will point out is you want to, if you're going to reference any of your working variables at the top in your component, make sure you prefix it with v dot. That's standard Salesforce namespace. You'll have to use that. If you don't use it, you're not going to get a compile error. It just won't work. So just make sure that you include that. The other thing we have here is an Aura if. So in Visualforce, again, when we might use rendered tags for, so if we just want to just conditionally display something, the rendered tag is now gone, and we have an Aura if block that's replaced it. Again, in our condition for that, again, if you're going to reference anything, so there I'm just checking the account length, make sure, again, you prefix it with the v dot. Okay, we also have here, this is our input at the top, where we can enter the account name. Another thing to point out on the UI namespace is we have an Aura ID tag that we can specify here for our input box. So I don't know if many of you would have used like JavaScript or jQuery, etc. in Visualforce. If you want to go and get hold of an element, you might end up using like jQuery selectors, etc. to go and actually pull out the elements you're after, and that will be the way because of the way that Visualforce builds up the ID blocks as it goes down. So you don't need to do that anymore. You can just specify your Aura ID, and it just makes it a lot easier when we get to the component to access our elements. And then again, just highlighting the v dot. It'll be a common theme throughout this talk. Okay, and then lastly, what we have here on the component is the button itself. Okay, so and on all we're doing is saying, okay, on click, all we want to do is we want to go and search the accounts. Again, so we're referencing that with a c dot, and what that is saying is go and look for the search accounts method in our JavaScript controller and go and run that. So let's go and have a quick look at what the controller actually looks like. Like I said, it's nice and simple, the controller, it's really lightweight. So again, just to throw it all together there, we have our AfterScripts loaded tag at the top, which was referencing the init method we want to run, and we also have our search accounts method, which we're calling off the back of a button. So in our controller there, we can see the two event handler methods there, and all they're doing is they're just capturing that, and they're passing it off to our JavaScript helper, which will actually go and do the work. So let's go and have a look at a bit of what the helper's doing. Okay, so obviously again throwing it together, at the top we're running our init method. We declared a account variable at the top that we want to use. We then got our controller, which we were just talking about, which passes it through, and then at the bottom there, that's actually what we're doing in our helper. And all we're doing in there is we're going, okay, all we want to do on load is we just want to create a new account object and just set that into our variable at the top. And obviously I'm using that just for the input bind. I just want to bind to the account name, for example. So again, what you can do here, if you can probably see that there, we can create these objects client-side. We don't need to go over to Apex to say, okay, please create me a new account. We can just do that client-side. The only thing to note if you're going to do that is if you wish to pass these server-side at any point, you will want to set this attribute here called sObjectType. And the main reason for that is obviously Apex is strongly typed. It knows exactly what it wants if you tell it it's an account. Obviously, if we're building that in JavaScript, it doesn't know, Apex won't know what that is unless we tell it. And then lastly, once we've created it, we're using component.set, which again is another standard method on our component. And all we're doing there is going, we're referencing our v.dummy account, which is our working variable at the top there in the middle. And we're just passing in the JavaScript object we've just built. And that will just go and set it in there. Okay. So the other things we are doing in our helper here is, so we've specified our collection of accounts at the top. We had our button to go and search the accounts, again, into our controller and into our helper. And then what we're doing here, so this is what I was talking about with the URI ID tag, is I wanted to go and get the hold of that element itself. So we can do that by using component.find. And we just pass it the URI ID, and that will just go and fetch the element and bring it straight in. Next, we can use component.get. It's another standard method. And all I'm doing here is I just want to get the input from the box and just actually validate they've put a value in it. So although we could use required flags in Visualforce to say this is our input field, this must be required, in Lightning that will give you a nice little asterisk, but that's not actually going to validate that anybody's actually put anything in it. So we actually need to go and verify that ourselves. So using the component.get, we'll go and get our value. And then what we're doing, once we've got the value, we just want to check whether there is actually a value in there. So rather than going to write it ourselves in JavaScript to check that there's a value and that it's not undefined, and all the other wonderful checks that we do in JavaScript, there is a standard utility class built in that is provided in the Lightning framework. So in that example there, we have $a.util.isEmpty. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Okay, so if it is empty, we want to put a message back to the user against that input field to say, please enter a value. Because we've already pulled the element out, which is what we did using that component.find, there is a standard attribute in the UI namespace called errors. And again, to set that attribute directly, we can just reference that v.errors. And then we can pass in a collection of our messages. So that's just please enter a value. The moment we do that, the UI will instantly redraw itself. We don't need to use any re-renders or anything like that. Okay, so if we go look at the fun stuff. So providing we have a value, we're going to want to go server-side to go and query our accounts. So what we're doing here, as we saw in the first slide, we referenced our Apex controller. And in our helper, what we want to do now is we just want to say, okay, we want to go server-side and we want to call our fetch accounts method. So again, in our helper, if we can do that using c dot, so rather than referring to our JavaScript controller, in the helper instance, this is going to reference our Apex method of fetch accounts. So once we've got a reference to that Apex method, we're going to want to set the parameters that it expects. So we can use that using .setParams, and then passing in, again, specifying the attribute name and giving it the value. So once we've got our reference, we've given it our parameters, we want to go and set a callback. And what we're doing here is saying, okay, what we want to do, we just want to go make an AJAX call to the server and get a response back. And so what we're specifying in here is going, okay, once the callback has come back and it's run, this is what do we want to do? So the first thing we need to do is we just need to check the state. That's a standard getState method that will, and then we verify that that was actually successful. So we can check it was a successful trip to the server, and it did exactly as we expect. Providing it's successful, we want to get the result back of the Apex method. So in this case, we're using response.getReturnValue, which will give us our list of accounts back that we got from the server. And then again, we call component.set to set that in the UI. So lastly, once we've set all this up, so we've got the reference, we've set everything up, we actually now need to go and fire this. So there is a $a.enqueueAction, which is built into Lightning. And this is basically saying, okay, we've set it all up, please go and load this on the stack, and it will just go and fire it off. One last thing I'm going to point out to do with this is this bit here. So in our callback, we are passing in what we want to do is we want to pass a reference to our JavaScript helper into our callback. Now, I could pass this keyword in, but obviously it's a reserved word. And the problem with that is so for example, once everything's successful and I've got my accounts back, if I want to call another method in my helper to go and process those results, I could call this.processMyResults. The problem with that is when the this keyword when we're running that and we're using the this keyword, it's in a different context. We're now, the this keyword is in the context of the callback and not in the context of the helper itself. So all we have to do there is we just set a different name that isn't a reserved keyword, such as self, and we just give it a reference to our helper. So by passing that in, if I then called self.processResults, it's going to know where it's looking to go and run. Let's go and have a look Apex side and see if there are any differences Apex side. So it's nice and simple, Apex side. All we're really doing is anything CRUD, anything else heavy lifting should be done in the JavaScript side. So at the top in our helper, we saw we got the reference to our fetch accounts and we set the parameters on that. So we can see here we have our controller, which is our account loader controller, and we were calling our fetch accounts method. So the main differences here is any method you wish to call from within your Lightning components, you have to ensure they're in Aura enabled, and you can do that just by marking the method there as Aura enabled. Now I've highlighted our return type here, and the main reason, just something to watch out for if you guys, when you guys are building this kind of stuff, is not all return types are supported currently by Aura. So a perfect example, if I had a method that was going to return a list of select option, for example, that's not currently supported by Aura, and it just won't let you do it. So you have to find other ways to go around. So I just suggest reading up on the return types. And again, with our parameters for our functions, there's a couple of things to note with this, things that have tripped me up in the past. For example, if I was expecting a date, we're going to be expecting a Apex, sort of Java-based date. If we're getting that date in JavaScript and we're going to pass that through, it's going to be in a different format to actually what it expects, and it won't work and it will blow up. So again, you're going to have to look at formatting the date properly, or convert it to a long, pass it across, and convert it the other side. There's just little things to watch out for. And then lastly, at the bottom, obviously, so once we run our query and we're returning our list of accounts, again, at the bottom of the helper there, all we're doing is using that response .get return value to set it into our accounts. I've managed to leave myself with 5 minutes, which is good. So does anyone have any questions around any of that, or want to know anything that wasn't covered in there? Any questions, anyone? Yeah.
Sorry, Jeff. Do you know when is it going to be available?
I don't. So if you go and read the documentation around the Aura documentation, it will tell you what is supported. I mean, it is going to be supported, but when that comes out, I'm unsure.
Okay.
I lead a development team. What's the best way of getting the guys and the lady? I lead a development team, so what's the best way to get the guys and the lady who's on the team from the Visualforce Apex development to this?
So
to the ability to use this.
The ability to use it. So, I mean, the key thing is it's quite straightforward to use from what I found personally, but I suppose the key thing is just ensuring that they've upskilled themselves in JavaScript and just making sure that people have a good understanding of JavaScript before they go ahead. That would be one of my main things to promote. The rest of it, it's not too different. There are bits of it that do speed up development time, but again, you're always going to get it with new stuff. There's always going to be that overhead of the initial upskill. I mean, once they've got that, they should be fine. But JavaScript is the thing I would say they'd need to learn.
Also, look on Trailhead. There's lots of Lightning module on Trailhead as well.
Yeah.
They have what they call Trailhead projects on there as well, and they are low-level, like Cody projects that will take a few hours to, maybe even a couple of days on that.
No, just to follow on the question. So why do we need to upskill in JavaScript? Because that's where our reservable controller logic will be done.
Correct, yeah. So the usual heavy lifting stuff that you would do in Apex right now, like the management of maps and all that kind of stuff. Ideally, we're taking that away from Apex now, and that's going to be done on the client side in your helpers. And because the helpers are all based in JavaScript, I would just say having an understanding of that will definitely aid you during the development phase. So if something runs, you're not sure it's not doing what it's supposed to, and you can't work out why, understanding how the JavaScript language works is going to greatly aid you in getting there.
So you say ideally, but is there still the opportunity or the option to do the controller in Apex, or it is mandatory to do that in JavaScript?
So you do still have your Apex controller, but you know this most of the heavy lifting you should be doing in JavaScript. That's definitely the way they're pushing for it. There's nothing to stop you grabbing your input, sanitizing your input, etc., and then going over to one of your methods and performing additional logic. There's nothing to stop you doing that.
Okay.
So the Apex is only private to Lightning. It can't be called through any other Ajax calling on the speed.
Sorry, say that again.
Well, you say it's an Ajax request from the browser to the
Yep.
Apex.
Yep.
Could I spoof that Ajax request?
So you're going to be wrapped around. So what they do have in Lightning is the locker service, and that is to prevent exactly that type of thing.
Otherwise, I'd have to replicate everything that's happening in JavaScript on the Apex end just to prevent kind of injection.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, there is a Lightning Locker framework that's wrapped around that, which is in by Salesforce, and that is their security model around the client side, and that's exactly how they're dealing with that at the moment.
Dead quick one. This is more of a comment, really, but I found when I've switched from to Lightning development, I've kind of like the dev console. If you're kind of used to doing Apex development, you're probably kind of maybe giving up on the dev console. It's actually really useful for Lightning because it helps you wire go from the markup to the JavaScript controllers a bit more easily. So I was just kind of wondering if you have any other sort of suggestions for tools that you might want to use or
Yes, there is the Lightning Inspector plugin which you can get for your browser. That will definitely give you an overview of what's going on, and it's a lot easier to debug like that. But even your standard browsers, if you go to the Inspect tab in your browser and go and look at the console, that is also a good way to go and debug. You won't always get the answer in your Apex debug logs because it's only really server-side stuff that you're going to get in there.
So you say that we have to learn more JavaScript to use Lightning. What would be the main aspects of JavaScript to focus on if you've had very little experience of it to begin with?
It's a tough one. I guess it's just the main key differences in the way it works is the thing you want. It's not so much syntax really that you need to look at, but it's knowing things like if you're in Apex, for example, you might null check something, for example. When you're in JavaScript, that could be null, it could be blank, it could be undefined. It's just knowing those types of differences between the two languages. Like I said, Salesforce, in the way they've built it, they do have their own inbuilt libraries to do a lot of that stuff for you, and it should be very, very similar when you come across in terms of how you code it. It should be a very similar sort of pattern. I think learning JavaScript is a good thing. It's definitely just going to aid you, but I would say you could transition without it and kind of learn those bits on the fly, should you need to.
Sorry, I also run a development team. Just want to understand, from your point of view, what's the biggest challenge in moving over from existing Apex code to Lightning enabled, and the move towards JavaScript?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I found when I moved across is, again, it's just the initial upskill. So reading how the process is supposed to work, kind of what we've just run through. That took a little bit of time to get around, and I think the probably biggest thing that took me the longest time is the longest time I think is just debugging. Like in Apex, when you're debugging, it's quite clear. You can go through your debug logs and find out what's happening, but it's not. I found it's not as clear in debugging. I think there's just a little bit. There was a few things that once you've seen them once and you kind of get to the bottom of it, you have a much better chance debugging later on. I just found the initial sort of debugging phase of the code just a little bit tricky.
Just the whole project transition to Lightning.
Oh, sorry. So,
code can be based org at the moment.
yep.
You know, are you saying that we should allow in the project to cut over significant time to go back and redevelop those actual
So, yeah, so there's a couple of things you can do with that, really. So if you have a lot of existing customization, ideally you're not going to want to go back and rebuild that for Lightning. But what you can do, if you've got new bits of work that are upcoming, you could definitely go down the Lightning road and start doing those. It shouldn't affect your existing stuff, no. And if you want, I think the main difference if you start doing that is you're going to get two experiences. You're going to have your old classic stuff, and you're going to have the new Lightning experience. So what I would probably suggest is if you wanted that look and feel across the entire org without redeveloping that, they do have what is the Lightning design system, which is the CSS and the styles that style everything. So what you could do is you could still keep the visual force there if you and your Apex. And someone could potentially go in and just reuse or just change the CSS to use the Lightning design system, and that will bring it in line with the look and feel of Lightning.
Hi, Chris. Just one last point. I'm kind of conscious you're running out of time here. What's the interoperability between Lightning and Visualforce like? Can you put a Lightning component on a Visualforce page or vice versa?
You certainly can, yeah, exactly that. So if you build, let's say that's one thing I didn't really cover. There are two ways you can surface your Lightning components. You can either surface them via an app, or if you want to bring them into Visualforce, you can. There is a Lightning out, which is what you can use. So in your Visualforce page, you can just put a small block of code in Visualforce that says, I want to load in this component that I've built. If you need to pass through any of the page attributes or anything to your component, again, you can pass those through in that call. And what that'll do, that will just then bring the component into the page and load it in. Any other questions? I'll take that as a no. If anyone thinks of any questions later or later on in the day, please come and grab me.